Good evening, everyone. What a powerful film. I want to introduce myself. Thank you all for coming. My name's Lauretta Charlton. I'm an editor at the New York Times. I also run a weekly newsletter called Race Related, which is focused on race, identity, and society. Thank you. And here tonight, we have Dylann, Steph, and Brian, who worked on this beautiful, very painful film. And so, thank you for joining, and I would like to jump right into the conversation. So, my first one is for you, Dylann, and also Steph, about your about Unanimous, which is your company that you're working on together, and this is a sort of debut project. And if you could walk us through the objectives of the company and its origins and some of your mission.
Yeah, so my background is brand strategy, and when Stephen and I, when we first started working together, kind of that foundation, where you start is with kind of who you are, what you want to represent, what you stand for, and the impact you want to leave on the world. And I was trying to dive into some of those questions and some of those topical areas with Stephen, and his answers really centered around one foundational theme, which was inspiration. And he wanted to use his platform to really inspire the world. And when the opportunity in media, in film and television came around, and brought it to Stephen and talked to him about the greater opportunity, the thought was that there is no more impactful way to inspire the world than through the sharing and the dissemination of content around the globe. And it seemed like a foregone conclusion that getting into the film and television space was the right move for us.
You know, on top of that, just I feel like I have a very strong foundation, understanding really who I am and how different I am amongst, I guess, peers and things that make me who I am. And for me to bring those pillars into life through this media space in terms of family, my faith, and obviously the world of sports. And so we try to find projects and stories that are inspiring, one, but two, fall into one of those categories that are truly authentic to me. And I think we've done a solid job of that so far, and obviously aligning with people that are great storytellers that have an eye for that field and doing it in a very, very big way and uplifting people that need to be uplifted. So that's kind of how we got into it.
Congratulations, and this is the first big project, and from what I understand, people will have a chance to see it in certain locations on a certain date.
Yeah, Ivy, you want to make that official announcement?
Yeah, so we are actually planning to release the film for the first time on the day that it happened, June 17th. We'll be releasing it in theaters across America, beginning on that day.
So the film is really hard to watch, and part of me wanted to start this conversation by saying I hate that it needs to exist, right? Like, I hate that this happened and we need to watch something like that. So as we move into the conversation about the film, the United States has a deep legacy of racial trauma and pain and suffering going back centuries. And I wanted to know why you guys decided to focus on this particular instance. Obviously, it's close to home, but I want to hear you sort of share that with us.
Like you said, I think it's a truly heartbreaking story. It's one that was well known across the country, across the world, and another incidence of senseless tragedy in terms of gun violence, in terms of racial profiling, racism in general. And so I think the biggest thing, we talk about some of the themes in the movie, but the biggest thing that came out was how faith and forgiveness permeated the family's response to this tragedy. And for me specifically, it's so hard to try to put yourself in their shoes or to empathize with what they're going through, but it's so inspiring the way that they handled it. Obviously, there's so many ways that could have gone down. There's so many ways that they could have used the cameras in their face and asking them all these questions. How do they want to celebrate their family members? How do they want to move forward and deal with the tragedy? And they chose forgiveness. They chose faith, and they chose to support each other and the community coming around them. And so that alone speaks volumes for humanity and the hope in humanity. That community in Charleston, the community around Emanuel, they did an amazing job of that. And so we wanted to be able to tell that story to the masses, so hopefully that gives hope to whatever you're going through. This is at the highest of tragedies, but anything that you're going through in life, just spread love, spread positivity, spread forgiveness and faith, and those things can help you out.
One of my favorite parts in the film is the early portion where they're talking us through the sort of history of the Black church, and how not only is it a place of worship, but it's also this place of freedom and resistance, and as a consequence, it's always been a target for white supremacy. So I wanted to hear about, Dylann and Steph, your experience in church. Did you grow up in church?
I did. I grew up in church. I guess my earliest memory of church is probably being about 4 years old. Non-denominational Christian church. The film is tough, right? I think I like to refer to it as the duality of faith, right? On one hand, there are a myriad of families that forgave Dylann for that tragic act. Their family members murdered, and I don't think there's any other way to look at that forgiveness than as an illustration of the power of God. Conversely, I also understand and can recognize the other side or the flip side of that coin, and the thought that Christianity has been historically used to keep the oppressed docile, subservient, and nonviolent to their oppressor. And I think some of the families chose not to forgive. But I think regardless of what side of that response you agree with, I think it's pretty pertinent to recognize that act of forgiveness was powerful. It was inspiring, and I think it provides a measure of hope.
I grew up in church, and I remember one of my earlier memories is going to Sunday school and Miss Taylor, and how you couldn't, one of the worst things you can do in church was disrespect the elders. And I think that's one of the things that makes this film really hard, too, is seeing those elders in church talking about how faith has affected their lives. Steph and Brian, do you guys have early memories in going to church?
Oh, for sure. I think one of my earliest memories is in Radford, Virginia, where my mom grew up. There's a church, New Mount Olive, right across the street, and it's the neighborhood church. And I remember as a kid, kind of like you talked about with the elders and the familiarity of that Sunday, and just the sights and the sounds and the views and the music and the vibe. It was kind of ingrained in me early in terms of what that could mean and tapping into that. When I actually gave my life to Christ in middle school in Charlotte, it was a Church of God in Charlotte, led by a white pastor, Pastor Livingston, but the congregation was fairly mixed, and so from that standpoint, it was never a question. Going to church was about just the community and love and worshiping God, and so I was blessed to grow up with that foundation, and that being a huge part of my life growing up, so that it could kind of set me on my way as I went into the world.
We have this foundation, Sonia Curry in the building. Everybody give Sonia Curry a round of applause.
So, I didn't grow up in church. I hated church. I hated Christianity in particular, I think. The first time I interacted with faith in a serious way was when I joined a gospel choir in college. I was definitely the only white dude. And that really started to change my perception. But I actually came to Christ when I was 22. So, yeah, hello. So I think this journey for me was about just being honest about what I didn't understand about the church, and in particular the African American church, trying to surround myself with people who did understand so that the film could be reverent and respectful and an accurate depiction of a place that is the heartbeat, remains the heartbeat of that community.
So this question is for all three of you. I want to take you back to 2015. Where were you when this incident happened? How'd you find out about it? Who told you? Where'd you read about it? Was it on Twitter? Was it on television?
I was in the Bay Area. I don't know exactly. Yeah. Bay Area fans? I don't know. I can't remember exactly where I was, but it was a situation where I was on social media and you get one of those breaking news alerts or whatnot, and
In the New York Times.
in terms of what's going on, and to be honest, how often this happens in our country is way too much. You almost get numb to it, and it's like, this is a kind of a who, what, where, and you don't want to have that initial reaction because it's such a traumatic thing for these families, what they're going through. But in terms of like, again, how often and frequent it is, it just makes you angry. And again, for me, growing up in North Carolina, having spent time in Charleston, understanding this, the kind of lay of the land down there, it was definitely heartbreaking. And then you follow the events from there, and a lot of that was depicted in the film in terms of the initial hearing where family members are speaking up as they see Dylann for the first time. President Obama in his moment, giving the eulogy and those type of things, and that's where the hope and the faith starts to creep back in. And so those are really powerful moments. But and again, why this story is so impactful, I think, even 4 years later.
I was on my honeymoon, and I remember I was standing on the balcony, and I was looking at, of course, a beautiful sunrise, and I walk into the bedroom, my wife's in there, and she's just weeping, and I'm thinking, like, what did I do, I didn't think it was that bad. So, is this being taped? I'm so sorry. So I'm seeing her, and she has her laptop out. And of course, we've been off the grid entirely being on our honeymoon. And I just said, "What's going on? You okay?" And she said, 9 people got shot in their Bible study. I said, what are you talking about? Of course, that's a place we were both very familiar with. And I said, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" Okay. She says, No, you don't understand. They're forgiving him. They're forgiving the guy who killed them. And I remember looking at my wife in that moment, and I remember saying, man, whoever tells this story better not skip that part. I had no idea that I would ever be a part of that.
I should have went first. I was in Portland, Oregon, and I saw it on Instagram first. And when I started to read about it, I said, we had seen a myriad of tragedies, and I was like, this guy's gotta go to jail for this one. I'm like, this one seems pretty plain and clear. But more than the tragedy, I remember President Obama's response to it. Ironically, at the time, I was contemplating changing my whole career and going to work at the White House. I was going, they had just told me how much I was going to be paid, and I was like, I don't know about this job. But seeing the way the president responded to the tragedy told me without a doubt, like, that's something I wanted to be a part of. So that's how I heard about the tragedy.
So, forgiveness. Round of applause for forgiveness is a huge theme in this film, and we've talked about it already quite a bit. But I also remember the week after, and I remember the victims forgiving, and I also remember my reaction being, this cannot be. And I remember specifically an op-ed that was written by Roxane Gay, and I just wanted to read the first couple sentences. I do not forgive Dylann Roof, a racist terrorist whose name I hate saying or knowing. I have no immediate connection to what happened in Charleston last week beyond my humanity and my blackness, but I do not foresee ever forgiving his crimes, and I am wholly at ease with that choice. And, you know, they talk about in the film, through that act of forgiveness, there was, you know, mobilizing that couldn't be done. There was truth-telling that couldn't be done. Did you have a moment where you kind of needed to take a pause and say, you know, if we didn't skip right to the forgiveness part, we could have done some work of, you know, racial reconciliation or just recognizing that the horrifying nature of what happened?
For sure. Forgiveness is a problematic idea societally, right? Like being forgiving of racism in general. Person to person, it tends to be a little different. I think the families are certainly all over the map as far as where they fall on that. And I think forgiveness was something that white America adopted very quickly for the same reason we always do, which is so we don't have to deal with the reality that we had a 400-year head start, among other things. And that my white privilege, I'm woke enough to realize, comes from a legacy of white supremacy. So I think that was a huge problem. But for the families on an individual basis, I think it meant something different than forgiving racism. I think it was saying to this individual person, which is what inspired me the most. As you notice, Felicia Sanders doesn't actually say, I forgive you. She says, we enjoyed you, but may God have mercy on you. And I think that was a statement not only of personal freedom to say that I am free from being your emotional prisoner. It's often said that unforgiveness is drinking poison and hoping the other person will die. And I think Felicia set herself free, but she also loved Dylann Roof in that moment, saying that I recognize your humanity and I long for your redemption, which is something that I am personally very inspired by and I long to emulate in my own life.
I want to hear more about the process of making the film. Who did the interviews?
Great question. So my good friend, producing partner, Dimas Salaberios, who's here tonight.
Where's Dimas? Oh, he's backstage.
6'6" from the Bronx. Where are you, D? Come on, man. Say hello, brother. So for me, it was important to me that with the families in particular that Dimas did the interview. Something I learned from this process early on is that it's very hard for a white person to grieve properly with a black person. And I think it's awkward and it's inappropriate. I think there's something I'll never understand. And I accepted that, and so Dimas was the one who really had the courage to sit in those rooms, and I was the one in charge of the camera, making sure it looked right and everything. But a lot of the other interviews I did conduct with a lot of the white people in the film, but also with a lot, but together we were able to handle that. and I think the families felt honored and cared for in that process. So,
When I think Unanimous had just landed on Sony when we met Brian, and he came in and told us what he was trying to do with the project. And I think, one, he told us this whole story, which was incredibly inspiring. If we had another hour, that would be a great thing to listen to. But after he told us the story, he told us about the families, and that this film was about the families, it was about raising money for the families. And we've always considered ourselves, Unanimous Media, a purpose over profit company. Profit's important, but nothing's more pertinent than purpose. And when he told us what he was trying to do, we immediately we had to get Stephen on the phone right away. And obviously, Stephen being from the Carolinas, hearing the stories about the families, hearing what the goal was for this film. I think even furthermore, what Unanimous stands for as a company. I think my partner, Eric Payton's sitting out there. Wave for him. Wave to him, Eric. There you go. I don't think we could have dreamed of a better film, a better project that represented what we wanted to stand for as a company than this film. So it was a foregone conclusion.
Continuing the subject of forgiveness, I wanted you guys to tell us whether or not you believe in the death penalty.
Well, you trying to throw a little curveball out there. Okay. So, I think that's an interesting question. And, okay, so I think I understand the rationale behind the death penalty, right? And the purpose it serves. But I think personally, I would be in favor of finding other methods, other avenues, and other ways of redeeming and rehabilitating an individual.
Along those lines, I say I don't believe in the death penalty. I feel like there are situations where an individual can be redeemed or be healed, and mentally, physically, whatever the issue is at root of why they're in that situation. They do not need to be a threat to society at all. And that needs to be taken care of first and foremost. And I understand there are other implications of what that means for a life sentence and a long-term care for that. But just in terms of what I believe in humanity and the redeeming qualities of my Lord and Savior and what that means for somebody going through the worst of the worst, nothing is impossible for that. And so I think that can live out through not putting somebody to death because of a situation.
I think, of course, does Dylann Roof deserve to die for what he did? Yeah, for sure. I don't think... but I think that's never what people aren't saying when they forgive him. They are saying, in spite of that, we still love you. So, do I think people deserve it? Yes, but would I say I believe in it and think it solves the problem? No. And I do think we fail way before they get to the Bible study with the gun a lot of times. And there are things we can do before that even becomes a conversation we have to have. So that's where I land.
Another thing that struck me while watching the film was how difficult it must be to relive that trauma and have it filmed. So can you share with us like how you prepared for that, or how you prepared the victims to share their stories so vividly?
For sure. I mean, I think for us, no one was a means to an end. So what we did contractually with each person we interviewed was we said that any money we make as producers, we want to give back to you as a gift. And we're willing to put that into the contract before you sign it. And so I think that gave them a level of trust in who we were and what we stood for, that they were willing to sit in a room with us. And we also always met them without any equipment to make sure they understood we were here only by their permission and blessing, not because we wanted to just make a movie or something. I think the healthiest question for every documentarian to ask themselves is, should I make this, or should I tell this story? And we certainly ask that question of the families and of ourselves.
Steph, what is the most powerful moment in the film for you?
I mean, there are so many to choose from. Obviously, in terms of every family's, take on what they went through, the way that they tell their story, the passion behind it, how they celebrate their family members. The two that stick out to me the most, just because I think I can, if there's any way I can relate to what the mindset that he was going through, was Chris Singleton, as a young athlete who's he's spirit-led in what he's doing. He thinks he has a higher purpose and knows he has a higher purpose and a God-given ability to play, baseball, and that's what he's wrapping his mind into. And that he finds motivation through a verse that he writes on his wrist, and that keeps him going every day. And he thinks it's for a certain reason. And like he talked about, when his mother passes and is taken away from him, that verse takes an entirely new meaning for him. In the face of adversity, in the face of tragedy, how can I get through it? And I try to picture myself, like, would I have the awareness to, respond that way? Would I have the maturity and the courage to say, and the strength to say, you know what, this isn't gonna defeat me. It's a terrible situation. He loves his mother. This is not going to defeat him, and he finds that inspiration through something that was in his life already, but he kind of redirects that, and that was a powerful moment for me in terms of seeing him in the gym doing an interview so soon after his mother passes, and taking on the forgiving qualities that were empowering to him, and an example to his sister who's there, and the rest of the people that knew him. And then again, President Obama, in terms of the amazing grace, the community in the church, everybody who was watching that, it was just a communal experience that I think gave so much hope, and still you could see on his face the depth of that moment, and I think that was extremely powerful.
Trying to say, let's talk about sports and the country being divided at the moment, and how one rationale for people who feel sports should not be political or should not be a space for politics is that because the country's so divided, sports is supposed to be entertainment. What do you say to those people who feel politics should be left out of sports?
I say athletes in general, and especially in the N.B.A., guys are educated, they know what they're talking about, they're passionate about what they believe, and there's a reason that you say something and there's a headline. People want to hear what we have to say, so we shouldn't shy away from it. As it is a game, it's a sport, it's for fun. There are millions and millions and millions of people that watch, and that platform is extremely powerful if used in the right way. And we have a league that supports each other. We have a commissioner that supports us in using our voice and speaking for those that can't speak for themselves. And I think this era of athlete is unafraid to be unapologetically themselves, no matter what that means. And so I'm blessed to be able to play in this league, and blessed to have the support that we do, and blessed to have the platform that I do, and I will continue to use that until I don't have it anymore.
Dylann, I wanted to talk to you about your personal experience with racism. Can you share maybe the first time that you encountered racism?
I don't know if I can remember the first time, but I can tell you about the most memorable time. Probably about 20 years old. I just got finished done at probably like, I don't know if it was Target or one of those stores. And I was taking a phone call in my car. And this phone call started to go long. And so I'm just kind of sitting in the car on my phone, and there's not many cars in the parking lot. And an officer kind of came up behind my car. I was like, here we go. So get off the phone and put my phone down. And the officer comes up, put down my window, and he's like asking me why I'm like in that parking lot. I'm like, just talking on the phone. So he goes, let me see your license and registration. I'm like, no problem. License and registration was on the floor of my car. So I go to reach down for my license, I head down like this, and then I hear him start cursing at me and yelling at me. I'm like, what did I do? I slowly move my head up, and he had his gun drawn, and his gun was to my head, sitting right outside the window. I was like, what did I do? What did I do? He was like, what are you reaching for? I'm like, you asked me for my license and registration. I'm doing what you told me to do. And I think it was a tough situation for two reasons. One, I never owned a gun in my life, right? So, your parents train you, your parents give you the very poignant lessons about dealing with those types of situations, but that was the first time I was in that type of situation. And once again, as someone who's never owned a firearm, I'm not thinking that this officer is gonna think I'm reaching for a firearm. I think the scariest thing to me was that his hand was shaking as he held this gun in my head. So he was nervous, he was scared. It's like, and I understood that he was scared of me, he didn't know me. I think the most interesting thing about this scenario is when the situation de-escalated, I had the opportunity to have a conversation with the officer. And he was real honest with me. He was just like, one, he told me he was scared. Two, he told me he thought I was reaching for a gun. And he said, and then three, he told me he could have taken my life. When he told me he could have taken my life, I'm like, I would have lost my life for no reason. And I think the hardest thing about the situation is that this officer wasn't a bad guy. After talking to him, I'm like, I've dealt with very difficult law enforcement, but truth be told, he wasn't one of them. Sadly, he was just scared. And it changed my perspective, and it's ironic to think that in a situation where my life could have been taken from me at 20 years old was actually the situation that would give me more perspective on law enforcement in general.
The reason why I asked that question is because of what you just mentioned with the talk, parents having the talk with their children. And Steph, I know you have children. How do you prepare them for a world, a reality where something like what happens in this documentary happens? What is the talk?
I think it starts with just making sure they are aware and educated and prepared for what's happened already, what potentially could happen in the situations they're in. My parents did an amazing job. I'm obviously blessed to come from a strong foundation where they provided a certain life where I didn't necessarily have to deal with face-to-face, racism in general, in terms of uncomfortable situations, things like that. But in terms of what they went through, what their parents went through, I knew all about that, and they were clear to make sure to tell me, one, how blessed I am to be, grow up the way that I did. But in terms of, this is real. This is stuff that people go through on a daily basis, and that I need to be, have that compassion and loving and caring attitude in terms of an awareness of what's going on. And so I will equip my kids with the same preparation, the same love. I can't necessarily show them what that means, but I can hopefully live that out. Me and my wife can on a daily basis, and prepare them and equip them with the necessary tools to be unapologetically them first and foremost, but not be naive and understand that this world is crazy. And they live in a crazy world, so to be prepared for anything, really.
Brian, one of the themes that appears in the film quite often is water. And for me, I thought, I just saw slave ships, and it occurred to me that in acts of desperation, slaves would jump into the water to avoid their fate. And I was curious to know, for you, what is the significance of those shots of water throughout the film?
Yeah, water was an important motif for me, I think because of the duality of the bones of slaves that have disintegrated in the water, dumped off the side of slave ships, but also the idea of water being redemptive, cleansing. The Bible says that the word is like water, and it washes you clean. And as a white guy, what I've learned through this process is that black and white people see these kind of things very differently. They see God differently. To an African American, it's this idea of equity, and looking at the cross and looking at redemption. And then for me, it's humility, understanding that before God, I'm a sinner who needs forgiveness too. And so the water motif for me served both of those purposes. It was something that carried the ships in, but it's also something that washes things clean. And I think that's the tangled knot of what this film is about too.
Dylann, why did you, I believe you went to Howard.
HU?
I'm happy to be at the Mecca. Wow. Why did you choose to have the event here other than being an alum?
It's an excellent question. So, I went to Howard University. The Howard University. So that's why I chose to have the event here, because I wanted that moment right there. But no. Howard changed my life. I actually spent my first 2 years of college at UCLA, and I transferred to come to Howard University. Howard was a game changer for me, and a film like this, there's no other place to show it. And Howard is affectionately referred to as the Mecca, right? And I think there's a quote by Ta-Nehisi Coates that I think perfectly defined it, right? He talks about Howard and the Mecca being two very different things, and Howard kind of being the academia, the classes, the university experience, but the Mecca being this infectious energy of people that look like you going to school here and achieving at a high level, and what we think of as the capital of Black intellectual thought. And I think when you consider those factors in this film, there was no better place to show this film. One more note on that. Brian Ivy and I, we were at Doc NYC, and we're premiering the film at Doc NYC. And after the film, I'm like, Brian, we have to show this at Howard, man. Like, we have to show this at Howard. And man, it's a blessing to be here and showing this film at Howard. So.
One of the things that Dylann Roof wrote in his manifesto is that he wanted to start a race war. And to some degree, given that the forgiveness happened so quickly, I was wondering if you guys felt like, was there any success in that, given how torn the country is on the subject of race and how difficult it remains to talk about racism centuries into the establishment of the...
Yes, that was definitely part of the reason why he wanted to start a race war. But I think part of the reason why we want to show the film on June 17th is to say that he lost, and to gather the nation together on that day to be, again, a part of rewriting that narrative. Not in this Pollyanna way where we now are just all getting along or something, but just to come together and have the hard conversations and to be face-to-face and to talk about these things. And that's what I'm hoping that day will mean. And so, no, I don't think he was successful by God's grace. And I think these families are the reason why.
What are some of the conversations you are hoping people have in the aftermath of... Oh, the lights just went up. Looks like we are winding down. So on that note, if you guys can all share the kinds of conversations that you hope people have in the aftermath of watching this film.
For me, I think it goes back to that duality, the duality of faith, the duality of forgiveness. And I think the film does an excellent job exploring both sides of that conversation. And I think the hope that is, I think regardless of where you stand, I think the hope is that the film encourages you and sparks you to kind of have that conversation. And I think ultimately, it serves as inspiration to its viewers.
Agreed. I think some of the themes that we've talked about today, and for me, a verse I come back to is 1 Corinthians 13:13, and of these three that remain, faith, hope, and love. In the midst of, again, grief, tragedy of that magnitude, these families found that, and that speaks for itself in terms of how we as humanity, how we as, no matter what race you are, where you come from, we can find that at the root of these tough conversations that we're having, and can continue to progress. We all don't know everything, but we can come together and continue to move in the right direction, and that's what these families spoke about and lived throughout this tragedy. That I think means a lot.
For me, God, I owe everything I am to the grace of God. And so, I really hope, there are a lot of things that come out of this, but more than anything, I hope people see that God is real, and I hope people see that he participates in the suffering of this world, primarily in the person and work of Jesus Christ. And I hope that is the message above all that people take away.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Steph. Thank you, Duran. And
thank you, Chase. Where are my guys at Chase? And thank you, Chase.
Yes, sir.
And thanks for having me, Howard University. Get home safe. Appreciate your patience, and good night.